The correlation coefficient, or R value, tells us how good of a fit the data is to a linear model, or how close it is to a line. So we have two different scenarios here. The first scenario, we're going to compare how motivated a student is compared with their GPA, with their grades. And generally, if a student is not very motivated, they're going to have a low GPA. And as their motivation increases, so will their GPA. And that will likely be a pretty good matchup, a very nice correlation, more or less. There's obviously going to be some things that don't fit exactly in the data. Sometimes someone might be a little bit less motivated, but maybe more naturally talented in certain areas and have a higher GPA that doesn't exactly fit. But more or less, it should be a pretty nice correlation. Whereas maybe if we take a look at this yellow scenario here and we say, okay, let's compare age with physical fitness. And perhaps this looks like maybe a slight negative correlation. So perhaps we could say that it looks like maybe as people get older, perhaps their physical fitness may go down a little bit. But it looks like there's a lot of area to kind of interpret that. That's definitely not necessarily true. People that are younger could have less physical fitness, and people that are older could have really high level of physical fitness. So it's not a perfect correlation by any means. Okay, so what the R value does is it's kind of like a rating for how good the correlation is. So first of all, let's just kind of think of these and how we would rate them. So if we look at the motivation versus GPA, I would give that a pretty good rating. So you might think maybe from 0 to 100%. Well, 100% would be a perfect line. So we're not going to get that very often. So it's not 100%, but maybe it's maybe 80%, 90%. Maybe let's call it an 85%. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that kind of grade that I give it, and that grade is according to how close it is to a line. So I may say maybe an 85% fit to a line I might give it. And so I'm going to give it an 85% as my rating. But for the R value, we're going to write that percentage as a decimal. So 85% would be 0.85. And that's going to be my R value. Okay? And so this is not exact. We're really just estimating. And so let's go ahead and take a look at this age versus physical fitness. And this is definitely not as good of a fit. So I would not give it, an 80 or 90%. I would give it much lower. There's still somewhat of a correlation. So I'm not going to give it 0% or 2% because there's somewhat of a correlation. But I may give it, maybe about 40%. So maybe let's call that a 40%. And to write that as an R value, I'm going to write it as a decimal. So that might be 0.40. And then we don't really need that 0. We can just call it 0.4. Okay, and that's kind of my R value. Now here's the other thing we need to consider. An R value is going to be negative if the correlation is negative. So in the motivation versus GPA, this is going upwards. This is an upwards trend, so it's going to be a positive value of 0.85, positive 0.85. However, in the age to physical fitness, that is a downward trend or a negative correlation. So if it's ever a negative correlation, then that's going to be a negative R value. So the R value will always be between -1 and +1. And if the R value is very close to -1 or very close to +1, then that represents a very good fit. However, if the R value is very close to 0, that represents a bad fit. So note here that negative does not represent a bad fit. Negative merely represents a downward trend. So for example, you could have a scenario that maybe looks something like this. So I could have a scenario with a very strong correlation that's going down. And since this is a very strong correlation, I might give it maybe a 95% rating. And so I'm going to call that 0.95, but since it's a downward trend, it's going to be negative. But notice the negative just says that it's going down. It's a negative correlation, but it's still a very, very strong correlation. It's a strong, obvious trend.